Welcome back to the reading and discussion of Jana Dixon's Biology of Kundalini. So if you've been following along, we are in the Enteric Brain on page 131. You can follow along on lulu.com for free or get your own copy of Biology of Kundalini Exploring the Fire of Life by Jana Dixon. And if you haven't watched the previous segments, you can go back and do that. They're all there on my YouTube channel. Okay, so yesterday we were introducing, or a day before, I think I missed yesterday, we were right into the nervous system, beginning this new section. And so now we're in the stomach, the enteric brain. The stomach, or enteric brain, comprises of 100 million nerves, more than the spinal cord. That's pretty intense. These solar plexus nerves in the enteric brain surround the esophagus, stomach, and intestines. Like the brain in the head, it has sensory and motor neurons, information processing circuits, and the glial cells, which we spoke about last time, really important cells. It also uses the major neurotransmitters dopamine, serotonin, acetylcholine, nitric oxide, and norepinephrine. So the enteric brain in your stomach is using all this. The gut can upset the head brain just as the head brain can upset the gut. Both the brain in the head and the enteric brain originate from a structure called the neural crest, which appears and divides during fetal development. One section turns into the central nervous system. Another piece migrates to become the enteric nervous system. And it is only later that these two systems are connected via the vagus nerve. The enteric brain is stimulated by stress chemicals and fear also. Fear also causes the vagus nerve to turn up the volume on serotonin circuits in the gut. So when we eat, pressure receptors in the gut's lining are stimulated and serotonin is released, starting the reflexive motion of peristaltic muscles in the intestines, the peristalsis. The gut plexus contains glial cells that nourish neurons, mast cells involved in the immune response, and a blood-brain barrier that protects important neurons. The mast cells secrete histamine, prostaglandins, cytokines, and other agents that produce inflammation as protective precaution. The gut is thus inflamed to prime it for surveillance. So know that these are a normal and natural part of the gut-brain's health, to have this sort of inflammatory and this immune response so that it can figure out what's going on. Surveillance, right? It's taking note. The HPA axis, the fight or flight hyperactivization during the peak Kundalini phase, may cause inflammation in the digestive system through the stress chemical stimulation of mast cells to produce inflammatory agents. Adding to the inflammation, the alerted immune system would liberally release free radicals also. Thus, we see the need to reduce stress during active Kundalini and adopt regular stress relief practices to calm the vagus nerve and reduce inflammation of the digestive system. So Ayurvedic medicine is really great for recommending anti-inflammatories like turmeric, and in some cases ginger is very good for that, depending on your body type. But also yoga and meditation, toning. I have some videos on the vagus nerve health somewhere on this channel. The inner arts and Kundalini skills mentioned in this book will do this, so she's going to mention some later, as will most of the regular spiritual practices. Merely being distracted, disassociated, medicated, in denial, or using addictions to avoid hyperarousal or the acute stress response will not make it go away. Suppression of the ongoing crisis of hyperactivization of the autonomic brain or brainstem might lead ultimately to serious imbalances or disease. So if we're suppressing these impulses and we're not dealing with them, we're not utilizing the right methods, she's saying that's when imbalance or disease can happen. While mastery of the situation through proactive facing the challenge of metamorphosis, the metamorphic agitation of the nervous system, prevents physical, mental, and spiritual degeneration. So we've got to face this stuff. We got to look at head on. We got to work with it with tools that we can learn, and we are learning through reading, or that I share with you if you want to work together, or some of the other videos on this channel. Okay, glutamate. Glutamate, we mentioned this the other day. Glutamate is a major excitatory amino acid neurotransmitter, accounting for an estimated 40% of all nerve signals in the human brain, and involved in phenomena such as neural development, learning, and memory formation. So this glutamate is really important. Glutamate is ordinarily released under close cellular biochemical control and reuptake. For in excess amounts, it's also an intense excitant of nerve cells and potentially toxic. So you don't want to go out and just start adding a bunch of glutamate to your diet, because it can be potentially toxic in too much amounts, but your body keeps a close eye on how much you need and releases it. The neurotransmitter glutamate and aspartate act as excitatory signals, while glycine and GABA inhibit the firing of neurons. So those work together. The activity of GABA is increased by Valium and by anticonvulsant drugs. Okay, so GABA is inhibiting the firing of neurons. So if we add Valium or anticonvulsant drugs, then it increases this inhibition of the neurons firing. Glutamate or aspartate activates N-methyl-D-aspartate or Nmda receptors, one of the 3 major classes of glutamate receptors, which have been implicated in activities ranging from learning and memory to the specification and development of nerve contacts in a developing animal. So this Nmda receptors are really important for learning and memory. Nitric oxide can diffuse across the synaptic cleft back into the synapse that originally released the glutamate. So that nitric oxide can diffuse it, okay? This retrograde transport of nitric oxide is thought to reinforce long-term potentiation, and thus is considered to be a possible molecular mechanism promoting long-term memory and learning. So nitric oxide being produced in the body through some of these chemical responses is sent back to the cells, and it's a long-term potentiator, so it's helping you remember things long-term. So this is an important part of the process. And we noted earlier that in Kundalini activation you can get excessive nitric oxide, which can lead to extra free radicals, but no, we don't want to eradicate the nitric oxide completely. We need it for things like long-term memory, but everything wants to be in balance, right? In homeostasis, not too much, not too little. And when it does go up, we want to be able to support the body's need for it. Glutamate may play the central role in Kundalini awakening. The prolonged firing of kindling releases glutamate, which activates the N-methyl-D-aspartate Nmda receptors in the spinal cord, which may sensitize the spinal cord neurons to become more responsive to all inputs, resulting in perpetual hyperexcitability. Now, so when you're first getting activated in Kundalini, you can feel super sensitive, super hypersensitive, empathic, and that's from what we just read. Those spinal cord neurons are super sensitized, okay? When glutamate is produced and released by a synapse, it activates the Nmda receptor, leading to an influx of calcium ions, which in turn bind to calmodulin, activating the enzymes that synthesize nitric oxide. Calmodulin is a calcium binding protein that is considered a major transducer of calcium signals. Glutamate receptors are selective for calcium ions. Prolonged activation of glutamate receptors stimulates eNOS via calcium calmodulin complex, binding to the synthetase. Nitric oxide can only be synthesized, however, if the amino acid arginine is available. Thus, neuronal NOS critically depends on arginine, which is mainly synthesized in adjacent glial cells and is transported into neurons. Arginine uptake into neurons is controlled by the non-NMDA glutamate receptors. This became evident when these receptors were blocked by arginine uptake inhibitors such as L-lysine, which functions as an antagonist to glutamate receptors. So I have to bring this up because L-lysine is very popular on the market for people to get rid of things like cold sores, which is a viral kind of infection. But the L-lysine can be an antagonist for glutamate receptors, which means it can downplay the role of glutamate in the body. And remember, this is important for the Kundalini activation. You don't want too much, obviously, but you do want enough. The N-methyl-D-aspartate, NMDA receptor, is a subtype of glutamate activated ionotropic channels that is implicated in synaptic mechanisms underlying learning, memory, and the perception of pain. It is also believed to be a target of the intravenous general anesthetic agent ketamine and possibly nitric oxide. Because it is affected by anesthetic agents, the NMDA receptor is probably key to conscious aspects of consciousness. So she's just explaining these different amino acids and neurotransmitters that are part of the awakening process and consciousness. She's saying this NMDA receptor, because it's a subtype of the glutamate activated ionotropic channels, it's implicated in memory and the perception of pain. It's also believed to be a target of the intravenous general anesthetic agent ketamine and possibly nitric oxide. So ketamine, if you've ever heard of or used it, is usually an isolated animal tranquilizer that some have used to disassociate from pain and traumatic events in order to have a healing. So it has an anesthetic kind of pain relieving element, I guess you can say. So that's being mentioned here. So let me continue. Because it is affected by anesthetic agents, the NMDA receptor is probably key to conscious aspects of consciousness. So like if it's inhibited, your consciousness is affected. You lose consciousness or your consciousness shifts. Presumably glutamate acts at NMDA receptors on NOS terminals to stimulate the formation of nitric oxide, which diffuses to adjacent terminals to enhance neurotransmitter release. In the cerebellum, NOS occurs in the glutamate-containing granule cells as well as in the GABA-containing basket cells. Many of the cerebral cortical NOS neurons also contain GABA. Release of both acetylcholine and dopamine from the nerve cells is blocked by NOS inhibitors and enhanced by plentiful L-arginine. One possible reason why there's such a hemispheric difference in the flow of Kundalini could be the different placements of glutamate receptors between left and right side of the brain, she surmises. According to Isoa Ito and his team, they found more NMDA receptors on dendrites at the tip of neurons on the right hemisphere, and in the left brain they were found at the base of neurons. This may explain why the left is more Kundalini excitable, active, analytic, logic, language-focused, decision-oriented. The right represent a more parasympathetic nature involved in emotion and memory. So depending on where there's more NMDA receptors. The overall excited condition of Kundalini arousal is probably mainly carried both on the norepinephrine nerves and via glutamate receptors. Nitric oxide and the Ca2 plus levels being the rate mediating factors in the maintenance of the charge throughout the glutamate system. After the body recycling period of the die-offs are finished, the slow depletion of arginine will reduce nitric oxide and growth hormone production, thus reducing hyperneural activity and regeneration of tissue, and the awakening will gradually come to a close. So it does change, your experience does change as the chemistry changes. Sometimes when we think like at the awakening and we get this massive influx of inspiration and poetry and we're super in tune with our intuition, and then we go through the die-off kind of crash phase, it can be a little disheartening because you do tend to lose some of those gifts for a while until you are, work the energy through your body, and then it's like you earn it again. So you get a glimpse into what's possible, and then the chemistry doesn't support it anymore. And so then you have to go back and you have to learn it. So, for reduced concentrations of nitric oxide will downregulate the Nmda receptors, reducing the excitation of the neurons. And also, since calcium resources of the body would be used to buffer the acidic products from the increased metabolic rate, calcium availability might eventually become a limiting factor, bringing the hyperexcitation of neurons to an end. Since glutamate can be made from any sugar, carbohydrate, or even from protein or fat, it is always somewhat readily available as an excitatory neurotransmitter. However, since a low glycemic diet does reduce Kundalini and seizures, it is apparent that glutamate levels are also a mediating factor in the firing rate of neurons. So people eating low glycemic, low carb diets, that has been shown helpful to reduce seizures in some cases, but also Kundalini activation. So I've heard some say they want to reduce their Kundalini activation, and so have wondered if they should eat low glycemic, but I'm not a big proponent of that. That's just my opinion. Let's read this section, Glutamate Toxicity, and we'll end with this today. Glutamate neurotoxicity can cause neuronal cell death. This is important. Reactive oxygen species are mediators of delayed neuronal degeneration caused by activation of ionotropic glutamate receptors. Oxidative stress was also shown to precipitate programmed cell death or apoptosis. The lineage between these two phenomena relate to the fact that the mitochondria are the source of 80% or more of the oxyradicals generated in the neuron, and that Ca+ deregulation causes excessive activation of glutamate ionotropic receptors, disrupting the mitochondrial electron transport system. The immediate effect of glutamate on neurons is its role in activating glutamate receptors. NMDA is a methylated derivative of aspartate. The stimulation of NMDA receptors may promote beneficial changes in the brain, whereas overstimulation can cause nerve cell damage or cell death during seizure, trauma, and stroke. When neurons are damaged, glutamate pours out, builds up in the synapses, and kills them by overexciting them, enlarging the area of brain damage. Both oxygen deprivation and overexcitation of neurons can create an abnormal buildup of glutamate that kills neurons by overstimulating them. So remember, too much glutamate is bad, but not enough is also detrimental. Glutamate works by attaching to N-methyl deaspartate, NMDA receptors, protein on the cell surface. Okay? The action of the NMDA receptor appears particularly important because they have a special ability to let large amounts of calcium into the neurons. When the brain suffers an injury, such as a stroke, neurons release glutamate onto nearby neurons, which become excited, causing excess calcium release to activate enzymes, which eventually lead to destruction of the cell. Because of their gatekeeper role, the NMDA receptors are important targets for developing therapies to reduce glutamate action. Drugs that block these proteins called Nmda receptor blockers can prevent glutamate from harming neurons and stop the enhanced glutamate excitatory activity typically seen in epilepsy. Nitric oxide is associated with the main excitatory neurotransmitter, glutamate, and the generation of action potentials in the nerves. Small amounts of it open up the calcium ion channel of the nerves, along with glutamate, an excitatory neurotransmitter, sending a strong excitatory impulse. That's small amounts of glutamate. Larger amounts of nitric oxide can force the calcium channels to fire more rapidly, which can lead to apoptosis or programmed cell death. Thus, nitric oxide mediates the neurotoxicity of glutamate through the formation of cGMP by activation of glutamate receptors. As stated in the section on nitric oxide, the cGMP participates in signal transduction within the nervous system. So I know that's a lot of complicated chemistry, biology, but glutamate and nitric oxide, there are regulating features, okay, to regulate how excited that the cell is able to get, or how much excitement we can handle. In the brain, a stimulus such as glutamate acting on NMDA receptors triggers CA2+ influx, which binds to calmodulin, thereby activating NOS. This mode of activation explains how glutamate neurotransmission stimulates nitric oxide formation in a matter of seconds. In blood vessels, acetylcholine, acting as muscarinic receptors on endothelial cells, activates the phosphoinositide cycle to generate CA2+, which stimulates NOS to produce nitric oxide for blood vessel dilation. If you caught all that. The influx of the CA2+ into neurons activates an enzyme called calcium calmodulin dependent kinase 2. Kinases attach phosphate groups to proteins and alter their function. In this case, the CAMK2 phosphorylates a second type of glutamate receptor called AMPA receptors, which makes them more permeable to sodium ions, thus lowering the resting potential of the cell and making more sensitive to incoming impulses. In addition, there's evidence that the activity of the CAMK2 increases the number of AMPA receptors at the synapse. So yeah, this is a lot of heavier chemistry material, and it really is trying to give an overall, especially if somebody is very well versed in brain chemistry, what is going on when there's a Kundalini influx of energy, what the regulation looks like, what it should look like, what elements need to be present. I said we were going to end with that one, but I want to end with protecting glutamate receptors, because this feels like the most important one. And then we're going to go into the neurotransmitters themselves next time. So let's just do this one segment. Studies found that alpha lipoic acid improves memory in aged mice, probably by a partial compensation of NMDA receptor deficits. It is thought that its free radical scavenger properties, which is one of the best things that the alpha lipoic acid does, preserves the cell membrane and so protects loss of NMDA receptors. It also protects membranes and receptors through improved sugar and insulin metabolism. That's a good one to know. Alpha lipoic acid is a unique antioxidant because it prevents and may even reverse the attachment of sugar to protein, a process known as glycation or cross-linking. Alpha lipoic protects cells of AGEs by allowing better metabolism of sugar in the cells. This prevents its buildup, and also by allowing the body's natural repair mechanisms to work better. A team of researchers led by Bruce N. Ames, professor of molecular and cell biology at UC Berkeley, fed older rats acetyl L-carnitine and alpha lipoic acid. They found that the combination of the two supplements effectively reduced aging, by tuning up the mitochondria, rejuvenating and energizing cells, and both spatial and temporal memory, and reduce the amount of oxidative damage to RNA in the brain's hippocampus, an area important in memory. It is advisable, therefore, for those undergoing Kundalini to take L-carnitine and alpha-lipoic supplements, as well as adopt a low glycemic diet, she says. Apparently, the glutamate receptors in the brain of drug addicts retreat into the cell membrane, perhaps to try and prevent the cell from becoming overstimulated by all the chemical stimulants. She says she was thinking that during the peak, when the sympathetic nervous system is fired up and endorphins are blasting full bore, the brain would exhibit overactivated conditions similar to a drug addict's brain. Perhaps in Kundalini initiates, the glutamate receptors also retreat into the cell, she's hypothesizing, thus adding to the burnout and the lengthy recovery period after the peak. And now she quotes, "One of the problems in addiction is that the neurons in some parts of the brain lose glutamate receptors from the cell surface, and those receptors are important for communication between neurons. The researchers have sidestepped this problem by crafting a peptide that mimics a portion of the tail of the glutamate receptor, and once inside the neuron serves as a decoy to prevent loss of glutamate receptors." And she gives a link for that quote, yourcolor.org. Anyway, so we can see how important these neurotransmitters are in the process of awakening, and that it can just be a little thing that bumps them from being in alignment, especially excess free radicals from stress and not being able to manage or handle or really know what's going on can also be some of the biggest contributors to problems during awakening. So thank you again for joining me. I know that was a lot to process, but I do also just know that by sharing, as I've said before, this material, there's a part of our consciousness that is getting it, even if it seems over the head or even if it was a mouthful and you don't feel like you got anything out of it, know that you are. So I hope you like this video. I hope you'll join me again when we get into the neurotransmitters in our next segment. And until then, this is Deja Bliss. Thank you for joining me, and we'll see you next time.